Well, the first day of the NATO summit in Ankara is over and we can draw some initial conclusions. Donald Trump stated that the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, and the Russian dictator, Vladimir Putin, want to reach an agreement and will make a deal in the near future, which means the war in Ukraine will soon be resolved. According to Trump, he recently had a rather long conversation with Putin and made it clear to him that it would be better to make a deal. In Kyiv, they don't really believe this, and the head of the office of the president of Ukraine, Kyrylo Budanov, stated that Ukraine is ready to fight for several more years if Putin does not sit down at the negotiating table. He said that there is definitely a staying power. Zelensky stated that Ukrainian long-range strikes on Russia have deprived Moscow of confidence in having reliably protected rear areas, and this should accelerate the achievement of peace. As Zelensky put it, quote, "We have completely destroyed Russia's very idea of having a strategic rear." In the corridors of the NATO summit, they say that Trump likes how Ukraine is hitting targets in Russia, and he once again called for intensifying such attacks to force Putin to make a deal. But publicly, Ukraine stated that Ukrainian long-range strikes have deprived them. In NATO, there is historical confidence in having secure rear areas, but this is not discussed publicly. At the same time, historic transformations are taking place in NATO. On one hand, the US announced today that it is relocating. The shift of weapons production to Europe involves Stinger missiles, ATACMS, and even Abrams tanks. Zelensky announced that part of the weapons production is being moved to Europe, including Stinger missiles, ATACMS, and even Abrams tanks. On the other hand, Europe is giving up strategic long-range radar detection and control aircraft and switching to more Ukrainian and Swedish aircraft. Trump also promised to lift sanctions and give Ankara back the F-35s. It was denied, but the planes are still covered. Trump also promised to lift sanctions from Turkey and finally return Ankara to the F-35 fighter jet program. Russians were officially urged, quote, not to panic over the fuel crisis by the State Duma of the Russian Federation. Well, if you didn't understand this slang about not panicking, that's what Deputy Volodin meant when he urged Russians not to panic. And it's not about Ukrainian drones. In general, the head of the Ukrainian president's office, Kirill, stated that Ukrainians should not whine or complain about the lack of gasoline after Ukrainian strikes and should remain confident in the presence of rear support. In general, we'll talk about all this and more in this episode. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, in this episode. My name is Alexei Pechi and let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, please subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. Today is July 7th, let's sum up the day. So today, July 7th, the NATO summit started in Ankara, and we already have a number of very important statements and even signed documents, as well as statements from Kirill from the Ukrainian president's office. Trump intrigued everyone with his plans to end the war in Ukraine and his lengthy conversation. They were deprived of confidence in having a reliable rear, but Zelensky stated in Kyiv that it was the first chronologically. Ukrainian long-range strikes on Russia, the so-called deep strikes, have deprived Moscow of confidence that its rear areas are securely protected, and this should accelerate the achievement of peace. This was stated in Kyiv by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. And then, Kirill stated that Ukrainian long-range strikes have deprived them of confidence that their rear areas are securely protected. For a long time, Russia considered its vast territory and rear are as an advantage, where it was possible to safely place military production and store equipment, and everything that warfare depends on, being confident that no one would be able to reach there, but we managed to do it. Zelensky's speech also referred to the strike on the Omsk oil refinery, which is located 2,500 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. And here's another quote from Zelensky. Ukrainian drones broke through Russia's defenses and struck a Russian oil refinery in Siberia. This is not an exception, this is the new reality, and there is not a single major oil refinery left in Russia that Ukraine hasn't struck. By the way, these are strikes. Да, это, кстати, правда. Ukraine, unlike the Russian Federation, is not fighting for pleasure or to pursue geopolitical ambitions. We are raising the cost of this war for Russia, and by doing so, we are increasing the chances of achieving peace. And I should note here that the strike on the Omsk oil refinery, the most powerful oil refinery in all of Russia, took place on July 6, the day before. And the drones hit the PMS units, the primary oil processing units. This is essentially the core and heart of the entire plant. And today it became known that the Ukrainian drone attack shut down the Omsk oil refinery. According to Reuters sources, as a result of the drone strikes, the AVT-10 primary oil processing unit was damaged. This facility accounts for about 38% of the entire production capacity of this enterprise. In addition, due to the attack, another important unit had to be shut down, AVT-11, which provides another 37% of the plant's capacity. It is noted that there was no direct hit on the second unit, but because another unit nearby was burning and debris was flying, it was also damaged. As a result, at the moment, the plant can only operate at 25% of its capacity. But it was decided to stop the plant's operation and try to restart the mothballed emergency oil processing units to compensate for the loss. Also, Zelensky said today at the NATO summit that Ukrainian forces eliminate about 30,000 Russian soldiers every month. According to him, almost 28,000 Russian occupiers were eliminated in June alone. Moreover, according to Zelensky, the armed forces of Ukraine have video evidence of the elimination of every Russian occupier. The overwhelming majority were eliminated specifically by drones. And, according to the president of Ukraine, Ukraine, as he put it, is not proud of this, that we are killing so many Russians. And Ukraine is simply recording such things in order to demonstrate that this is, quote, a war that we did not start, but are forced to fight. Also, Zelensky stated that Ukraine should be in NATO because, according to him, NATO with Ukraine is the alliance of the future. Quote, do you really think it's right to leave a country and a people with this level of defense capability outside NATO? If we already have such capabilities, then it makes perfect sense for this potential to become part of the alliance's collective defense. And it's important to note here that obviously both Kyiv and Moscow tried to raise the stakes right before the NATO summit. Ukraine intensified its deep strikes and today also hit with drones, as of now, already 10 tankers in the Sea of Azov that were trying to bring fuel into Crimea. In the previous episode, I talked about how overnight, in just one night, the Birds of Magyar, that is, the unmanned systems forces of the armed forces of Ukraine, attacked 8 tankers at once in the Sea of Azov, which were trying to bring gasoline into Crimea. И уже днем 7 июля tankers in the Sea of Azov were also attacked during the day on the 7th. So, at the moment, in one day, we have 10 tankers from the Shadow Fleet that were attacked while trying to bring gasoline to Crimea, 1 dry cargo ship and 1 ferry that was docked in Kerch. That's it. Plus, on top of all this, we need to add one more piece of news. Today, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Mikhail Fedorov, revealed the details of the special operation Ashan, as part of which the armed forces of Ukraine simply set back the capabilities of the Russians by at least 6 months, so they were unable to launch a full-scale offensive at the beginning of the summer. According to Fedorov, the Russian invaders were forced to move a significant amount of equipment away from the front line after the Ukrainian Ashan operation. By the way, this is what you might call a proper special military operation. Here it is. According to the minister, the first stage of the special operation was carried out last year. Specially designed drones were prepared for it, the necessary intelligence data was gathered, and a large-scale strike on enemy equipment deep behind the lines was prepared. In 3 days, Ukraine's defense forces hit 949 enemy targets. A few weeks ago, the second phase of this operation took place. This time, the main target was enemy artillery. A new munition was developed for the second phase of the operation, for striking artillery. Well, I mean a new type of drone with a munition. As a result, 231 targets were hit. In total, over the 2 phases of Operation Ashan, the Ukrainian Defense Forces struck 1,180 enemy targets. And all of this was done with drones, exclusively drones, and without any risk to Ukrainian soldiers on the front line.
In May 2025, Operation Ashan began. Over the course of several months, the Defense Forces, with the participation of the laser units and the 412th Nemesis Brigade, delivered the harshest blows to enemy forces on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Equipment, resources, logistics. 949 targets hit and destroyed at a distance of 50+ kilometers from the line of contact. The coordinated work of the defense forces significantly weakened the enemy's offensive potential. It took them months to recover their losses. In June 2026, a new stage of the Ashan operation was carried out, focused on the enemy's artillery. This time, the defense force units coordinated strikes on the occupiers' howitzers in the Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Starobilsk sectors. As a result, 231 targets were hit, 171 of which were destroyed. The effectiveness of the strikes has been confirmed by technical monitoring and intercepted communications. Already on the first day, the activity of Russian troops along the entire line decreased by 30 to 81%. In total, during the Ashan special operation, 1,180 targets were hit. Each target hit means less fire on Ukrainian positions and cities. Each such operation weakens the enemy and brings closer the moment when they will lose the ability to impose their conditions on the battlefield. The work continues.
Vladimir Putin, for his part, tried to impress Donald Trump with a statement about the alleged capture of Konstantinovka in the Donetsk region and claims that the Russians are supposedly advancing at a rapid pace along the entire front line. Well, let me remind you, I'm not making this up, these are his exact words. First of all, he himself announced that Konstantinovka was captured, although it wasn't. Secondly, he himself was telling the cadets, remember he gathered them in the Kremlin, and he was telling them that he says there isn't a single section of the front where the Russians aren't advancing. He says not a single one. The entire front line is moving forward. Those are his words. And obviously, with these talking points, he was trying to impress Donald Trump somehow, so that Trump would say, wow, you guys are really fighting. Yes, we need to force Zelensky to sit down at the negotiating table and surrender the territories. And here Putin was also bragging to Trump about his barbaric strikes on residential buildings in Kyiv. And here it turned out that Putin's statements about Russia's inevitable victory did not impress Trump. Trump stated that, in his opinion, Ukraine and Russia will be able to reach an agreement to end the war. The American president pointed out that he had a rather lengthy conversation with the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, after which he called the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Next is a quote from Trump. I think they both want to reach an agreement. It's a pity that it took so long, but I think something will happen. Something will come out of it. He also noted that the Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan is helping with peace efforts to end Russia's war against Ukraine. And I'll also note here that sources from Suspilne reported that indeed yesterday, on July 6, Trump held phone talks with Zelensky and Putin, but these conversations were not made public. So there is hope that the negotiation track is indeed moving forward, and there are optimistic forecasts that by winter, at least, a suspension of hostilities might happen. Although I personally urge everyone to treat such forecasts with great caution. Because, on the other hand, the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Kyrylo Budanov, suddenly stated today that Ukraine is ready to continue fighting with Russia for years if peace negotiations do not lead to results. He said that now there are enough resources and resilience. Separately, Donald Trump said that he cannot watch what is happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. Here is his quote. I saw the images from those battlefields. This is a drone war. This is a war using drones. This is a completely new technology. People won't even believe how brutal this war is. And I have seen the battlefields. Well, then he said that sometimes he even asks not to be shown those photos because it's hard for him to look at them and so on. Знаете, I hope Donald Trump was at least shown a couple of photos of burning oil refineries in Russia. And these huge lines of Russians at gas stations, hoping to get at least 20 liters of low-quality gasoline. Why low quality? Now, if you open any Russian social media groups, they all write that their cars have already started breaking down because the gasoline has so many impurities that cars just break down after 100 kilometers. By the way, today the Speaker of the State Duma of the Russian Federation, Volodin, said that he's already annoyed by these whining Russians at gas stations. He said, "You really annoy me." That's why he called on them, quote, not to panic because of the fuel crisis, but we'll talk about this a bit later. I don't want to focus on it now, we'll come back to it. Let's get back to Trump for now. And Trump wasn't just talking about Ukraine. Earlier, Trump said that he didn't even want to go to this NATO summit, but he came only because it's being held in Turkey. He calls him his friend. And so Donald Trump apparently prepared 2 gifts for the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He made it clear that he would allow Turkey to purchase F-35 fighter jets from the US. He also stated that Washington would lift the sanctions on Turkey that were imposed due to Ankara's purchase of Russian S-400 air defense systems. Well, I'll just remind you that it was Trump himself who initiated these sanctions during his first presidency. Now he says it's wrong to criticize friends and sanctions should end, but he seems to forget he imposed them originally. As part of resetting relations with Turkey, the US is considering confirming that Turkey has met the requirements for the sale of F-35S, while still insisting that Ankara abandon those Russian S-400s. Well, moreover, in Russia's war against Ukraine, they've performed very poorly. It was precisely the purchase of these surface-to-air missile systems in 2019 that triggered US sanctions and the refusal to sell F-35 fighter jets. And so, according to sources, Turkey is ready to agree to a compromise that would involve technical oversight from the US. But at the same time, it could keep the missiles in case of exceptional circumstances threatening national security. That is, what is meant is, let's mothball these S-400s, let the Americans watch and see that they're not operational, they're just mothballed, shut down, standing there and not working. But if, God forbid, we ever need them, we'd be able to use them. Erdogan stated that he has already received a promise for the delivery of 5 F-35 aircraft, but did not specify any details. But it's important to understand that the US Congress will still have to approve both decisions, both lifting sanctions and the aircraft sale. But there's no guarantee that Congress will do this. Israel is actively opposing the sale of F-35S to Turkey. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated the day before that this would upset the balance of power in the Middle East, where Israel currently possesses the most advanced weaponry. According to him, the strengthening of Turkey would also not be welcomed by the US's Arab allies in the region. Greece also doesn't want Turkey to become stronger, since Turkey continues to control northern Cyprus, which was seized in 1974. But today, a separate episode was released on what's happening in the Middle East. So go to the YouTube channel and be sure to watch it. Here we'll continue discussing the results of the NATO summit. It was at the NATO summit today that the topic of China unexpectedly came up. Reuters reports that Norway wants China to help bring Russia to the negotiating table with Ukraine. Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre even called on China to use its connections with the Russian leadership to help achieve a negotiated settlement of the war in Ukraine. According to him, this would also benefit Beijing's relations with Europe. He made the statement on Monday after meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Oslo. According to Støre, most of their conversation was devoted specifically to Ukraine. He spoke about this today on the sidelines of the NATO summit. Norwegian officials urged the Chinese to convey to the unwashed Russians that negotiations on Ukraine should begin without any preconditions. Just along the current front line, I'm talking about Putin, sat down and started negotiations. The first step should be a ceasefire based on the current front line. And as Støre stated, quote, this in itself is already a major concession from Ukraine because it's within their territory. And here Støre directly linked the topic of Russia's war against Ukraine and the relationship between China and Europe. Quote, there is great potential for deeper cooperation between Europe and China, but as long as this war continues and China remains a close partner of Russia, this limits that possibility. But after that, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha stated this after his meeting with that very Wang Yi. He received an invitation to visit China. As part of intensifying bilateral contacts with China, including at the highest level. There are no further details yet, but China's increased activity may again indicate a revival of the negotiation track. At the same time, tomorrow there will be a face-to-face meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. The president of Ukraine has already stated that he is in a fighting mood ahead of the meeting, and among the topics to be discussed will be the supply of Patriot systems to protect Ukraine from Russian ballistic missiles. But the Europeans are skeptical. As Bloomberg writes, European allies acknowledge that Ukraine has strengthened its negotiating position thanks to the development of drone production and its experience in warfare. At the same time, they are cautious about the prospects of the upcoming meeting between Trump and Zelensky. According to the agency's sources, the talks between Trump and Zelensky are likely to take place in a good atmosphere. However, due to the unpredictability of the US president, there is no certainty that they will end with concrete decisions. European officials also do not expect that after the talks, Trump will significantly increase pressure on Russia. This concerns both new sanctions and the resumption of American arms supplies to Ukraine. But at the very least, all European leaders expect that Trump will not interfere with Ukraine and Europe continuing to drive Russia back into the Stone Age. And as I promised, at the end of the episode I'll share a bit of news from the looking glass world so you can smile. The fuel crisis continues in Russia. Today, for example, Japan has banned the supply of aviation fuel to Russians, which they had been desperately begging the Japanese for. But as Vyacheslav Volodin, the Speaker of the State Duma of the Russian Federation, said today, Russians should stop whining and not panic in the face of the fuel crisis. He says people need to rally around the frail leader Putin and do what? Endure. Endure, sit and endure. According to him, the panic of Russians only plays into the hands of Russia's enemies, who are trying to destroy the country's economy. Next, I'll quote Volodin, when we face challenges and start to waver, to panic, all of this benefits the enemy. We need to be aware of this. We must be able to take a hit and go all the way. They wanted to destroy our financial system, but it didn't work. They wanted to tear our economy to shreds, but that didn't work either. Well, in the end, Volodin apparently inhaled too many fumes from low-quality gasoline and stated, quote, "It's important to remember that the participants of the special military operation in Ukraine are fighting for the future of our country in conditions where all Western countries are acting against the Russian Federation." Well, you know, in response to Volodin, let me remind you that until 2014, before those unwashed Russians invaded Ukraine, all of Europe was engaged in massive trade with the Russians, and they didn't even think about acting against Russia. There was the wonderful Angela Merkel, who, on the contrary, defended Putin, visited him, shook his hand, embarrassed herself, traded with him, and so on and so forth. None of that happened. But Volodin says the West has risen against us, it wants to destroy us, and so on. So what, Russians? Are we just going to endure it? Let me remind you that this tension among Russians is growing due to the severe fuel crisis that has affected almost all regions controlled by Moscow except for Chukotka so far. As a result of Ukraine's campaign to destroy Russian oil refining facilities, fuel sales limits have been introduced everywhere, as well as a ban on filling fuel into canisters. And the lines at gas stations in some places are already visible from orbital satellites. But, as Volodin said, Russians, endure it, because your motto is to endure. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and thoughts about this in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and hit the bell. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.